have to get my calculator out.
All right. We're going to sing now. All right. So on that sheet of paper is the music. We're going to do verse 1, verse 2, and then verse 3. Okay? In the sweet by and by. There's a land that is fairer than day, and by faith we can see it afar, and the Father who waver the way to prepare us a dwelling place there in the sweet by and by. We shall meet on that beautiful shore in the sweet by and by. We shall meet on that beautiful shore. Verse 2. We shall sing on that beautiful shore the melodious song of the blessed, and our spirits shall sorrow no more. Not a sigh for the blessing of rest in the sweet by and by. We shall meet on that beautiful shore in the sweet by and by. We shall meet on that beautiful shore to our bountiful Father above. We will offer our tribute of praise for the glorious gift of His love and the blessings that hallow our days in the sweet by and by. We shall meet on that beautiful shore in the sweet by and by. We shall meet on that beautiful shore. Good job. Don't forget, go ahead and write down your number on your sheet of music, and I'll come around and collect those. This is the number of how many days Gail has worked here at the church.
How many years is it?
How many days? How many days? How many days? All right. I'm going to come around and collect them. And now, Miss Donna, you got some funny stuff for us? Okay.
Won't let you know.
Yeah, I'm sure.
We got some hecklers in the crowd.
When I was used to
Put your names on your music too, so I know who's guessing what.
when I used to tell jokes over at the assisted living, I could always, when I would tell it, and I could see the smiles on their face, which always made me very happy, and they would laugh. And then sometimes they would sit there with solemn faces, and it's like, oh my goodness, I need to move on. So even if you don't find it funny, just laugh anyway. This way I know that you, or even if you don't get it, because sometimes they really didn't get it. All right.
We got our first heckler.
Oh my goodness, okay. All right, a woman accompanied her husband to the doctor's office. After his checkup, the doctor called the wife into his office. He said, your husband is suffering with a very severe and rare stress disorder. If you don't do what I tell you, your husband will surely die. The wife leaned forward, looked concerned, passed over her face. Doctor, I'll do whatever it takes to save my husband. The doctor nodded and said, be pleasant at all times. For lunch, make him a nutritious meal. For dinner, prepare an especially nice meal for him, but don't burden him with your chores. Don't discuss your problems with him. It will only make his stress worse. No nagging. If you can do this for the next 10 months to a year, I think your husband will regain his health completely. Wife nodded her head and said, I understand. On the way home, the husband asked his wife what the doctor said. He said, oh, honey, she replied, he said, you're going to die. Okay, this little information here reminds me of something that goes on in my home, so I'm not going to tell you till the end, and you might relate. But anyway, and I have to yell a little bit, like, where'd Steve go? Like Steve did last week, yelled at the screen. A wife was making breakfast of fried eggs for her husband. Suddenly, her husband burst into the kitchen. "Careful," he said, "careful. Put on some more butter. Oh my gosh, you're cooking too much. Too many, too fast. Too many. Turn them now. We need more butter. Oh my gosh, where are we going to get more butter? They're going to stick. Careful. Careful, I said, be careful. You never listen to me when you're cooking. Never. Turn them. Hurry up. Are you crazy? Have you lost your mind? Don't forget to salt them. You know, you always forget to salt them. Use the salt. Use the salt." The wife stared at him. "What in the world is wrong with you? You think I don't know how to fry a couple of eggs?" The husband calmly replied, "I just wanted to show you what it feels like when I'm driving." I know some of y'all can relate. Okay. There is no perfect life, no perfect job, no perfect childhood, no perfect marriage, no perfect set of people who will always do what we expect them to do. What we have is a perfect God who is able to lead us through this imperfect life with unfailing strength, incomparable wisdom, and infinite love.
We have a winner.
Have a
We
winner.
have a winner. Her guess what? She worked here. Gail was very specific. She worked
She
2,000
marks it on the wall in her office like a prison cell.
2,274 working days, or 80,376 hours, or 9 years, 2 months, 2 days, or 110 months, 2 days. And the winner is Joyce Beck.
Wow. Congratulations.
What was the number, Steve? It was 2,270.
Joyce is taking everybody to Starbucks. We'll see you there after this. Good job. Yes, every one of those seconds counts when you're working with a staff. So, I was taking notes on that second joke. I think that's a good idea. Fuss at my wife the way she fusses at me when I'm driving. It's funny how upset we get when we're driving and they do it to us, but then we find ourselves doing it back when the other's driving as well. So we're all imperfect people, so that's a good way to end that as well. So it's a good thing we have love, and God's given us that to kind of compensate for how imperfect we can be, even in our own homes with the people we love the most. And so today we're going to talk about love again, and we're on November 1st here on this warm day in April. We're going to go to lesson number 9, which is on page 39 in your book. I want to welcome folks who may be joining us online as well. And so we're going to be reading a few verses, quite a few verses as part of this passage. But before we do, I want to tell you a story about something I did in my crazy years. And you're thinking, in your crazy years? Yes. These aren't my crazy years I'm living in right now, as crazy as that may seem. When I was doing sermon illustrations in my 20s and 30s, they were even crazier than they are now. And Steve and I go back, as we've talked before, we go back a few years even before working together at Avalon for us to share the same anniversary date of coming here, essentially. It's kind of a neat thing, and God works in these crazy threads sometimes that we don't see the power of until later. But all that to say, Steve and I were working together for this big event. It was kind of a new thing for MACU, Mid-Atlantic Christian University, where we both worked previously. And I don't know, what year was it when we did ECE and the big trash thing and all that?
We did it a few summers. It was
The first year, I think, is when we did the...
2000 and
probably about 2006. We did this summer event called East Coast Encounter, and it was supposed to be kind of like, well, it would be, 2 or 3 days or so on campus, and there were people who were coming from all over the Mid-Atlantic region, high school students, and the whole goal of the thing was to make a multi-sensory event. So you'd come to a worship session, and it would lead into this other thing and other things, and so we would have a team of people together to plan on this thing. And one of the parts to this event, we were talking about Jesus preaching on hell. And when Jesus talked about hell, he referred to a very specific place that they would have known in their time known as Gehenna, which is like the Mount Trashmore for them, except it wasn't as nice as Mount Trashmore. It didn't have all the nice things like dirt on top of the trash. It just had trash. And they would set the trash on fire, and of course you can imagine the fire never really went out. It gave off this horrible smell, and there was always weeping and gnashing of teeth at this big fire pit because there were people in poverty, and then there were dogs constantly fighting over trash, and the worm never died. So all of these references that we think of that are specific towards this description of hell, Jesus was actually using this physical place that they could immediately, in their senses, in their mind's eye, think of as, I don't want to spend eternity there, as he described hell. And so we wanted our students who were part of this event to get a sense of that. So we tried to recreate Gehenna in the gymnasium at Mid-Atlantic Christian University. So the plan for that was we set up this huge, we put it all on this little stage area that's there next to the gym. And we set up this huge barrier, kind of like a plastic wall, and we put within that plastic wall these jet heaters. I don't know if you've ever seen those things, long cylinder, and it's basically like a jet engine almost when you hear it. It's a loud sound, and it just blows out this very hot air and heats an area very quickly. They use it in like commercial areas and stuff like that when they're working in buildings that don't have windows and all that. So this jet heater was going, and it would launch the temperature up to 80-some degrees or something. It was pretty warm. And in that space, we put plastic on the floor too, and we gathered as much trash as we could find, and we made this big pile of trash. But that wasn't enough. The heat and the trash wasn't nasty enough. We actually sent students out upon the highways and byways of Elizabeth City to find roadkill. And we had one of our teams successfully find roadkill. I think it was a raccoon that they found, that they scraped off the road, and they put it in a bucket, brought the bucket to the trash heap, poured the roadkill on top of the trash heap. Now, my job in that situation was to be one of the poor people on the trash heap that was basically, as the students came through, I don't know if you've ever been through these walks through hell and things where you used to scare people into loving God. Not quite the best way to get people into a place like that, but that happens a lot of times. This was similar to that kind of thing. The students would come in groups, and immediately they'd sense the difference in the temperature, and they would smell the difference in smells, and then all of a sudden they would notice this person creeping on the trash heap, and that was me, and I would preach to them about how difficult it was to be there and how that's never a place that you want to be, especially if it's an eternity, and I wish somebody would have done this for me when I had a chance to make a difference in my life, but they weren't there for me. You be there for your friends. So that was kind of the sermon that was there. Part of my thing, though, when I was climbing on the trash was someone actually went to Bojangles and got a box of chicken so that I could be chewing and gnawing on a chicken leg while I'm climbing around this trash and stuff. That's the kind of sermon illustrations that were happening in 2006. I think I was 30 years old at that time. No, 20 years old. No, 30 years old. Can't do the math. I have a Bible college education. So I've tamed up. The reason I wanted to bring that up is because I think that's a great way to get into, in fact, at the end of the lesson on page 42, where it says into the lesson, it says, would you be willing to take this job? Roadkill collector. Must be able to work long hours, braving oncoming traffic while picking up creatures of various sizes and breeds in various states of decay. Benefits include working outdoors, strong stomach a plus. And then it says John's gospel tells a story of Jesus' willingness to take on a dirty job in order to teach an important lesson to his disciples. And so that's what we're looking at today. Jesus himself would do things like this, maybe not to the extent of roadkill, but very close to it when he took on the job of washing these disciples' feet. And so we're going to look at that today and see how he demonstrates that as an illustration for how we should serve one another. So jumping into John 13, verse 1, it says, "It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father." You get a sense that he had a sense of timing throughout his whole ministry. If you remember, there were people that he healed early in his ministry, and he would tell them, when you go back into town, don't tell anybody what happened to you, right? And he was taking care of their needs and their time, but he knew his sense of timing was so keen that he knew had people started talking about Jesus' miracles early in his ministry, that would have set the wheel in motion too soon for him to be where he needs to be at the right time in Jerusalem. So that's how precise the plan was when Jesus was here on the ministry, on the earth doing his ministry, how precise the plan of timing was for the crucifixion. Now he knows the time has come, and he's already made a plan, and he's already set in motion his journey towards Jerusalem, and he knows he's not going to leave Jerusalem alive in the sense that we would think of it typically. And so, knowing this, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So that's one of the only places that you see that word love mentioned in this chapter. Then you'll see it demonstrated. So it says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Verse 2, the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Okay, so where are they right now? Like in terms of the kind of room they were in, things like that. Yeah, it's known as the upper room, okay? This is someone's house, and it's the upper room of someone's house. Jesus had sent Peter and John, maybe, ahead to prepare a place for them to eat the Passover meal. Okay, so this is recorded in the Gospels as well before this event. And, God's sovereignty, providence, all this stuff, they know where to go and who's going to be accepting of that. And so this person may have known of Jesus, heard of him as a great teacher, and had prepared the space. And so they knew where they were going and what they were doing, and they had a very specific purpose to eat the Passover meal together. They're in this upper room, which was probably designed for them to meet together in that way. And so as they're up there, it gives us this suspenseful insight that the devil had already, it says, prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. So my question is, I have a couple of questions. One is, did Jesus wash Judas's feet? It looks like, most likely, and we'll see this later, that it's likely that Jesus, knowing what Judas was about to use his feet to go do, still washed his feet in that room, as far as we can tell with the indication that we'll see in later text as well. So that's profound for me. That's a demonstration of love, loving your enemies especially, right? The second thing I want to ask you is, did Judas have a choice to do what he did? Okay. It's interesting, though. It says here, at this point, that Satan had already prompted Judas. Okay? So it's important that we see our choice exists. We do have a will, and we have a decision that we are given to make, but at the same time, that will and that choice can be influenced one direction or another. And in the other Gospels actually use some stronger language when it talks about Satan's influence on Judas at this point. And there is evidence throughout Scripture, which is a whole other lesson, that there comes a point in time where if you keep walking in that direction, there's no going back. That you can even lose free will as you continue to move into sin. Scripture declares this or describes this as being the hardening of the heart. Or if you think of the example of the Pharaoh's heart at a certain point was out of his own control. And if you look closely, you'll see right about the first 7 plagues, the Pharaoh basically makes the choice to bring the Israelites back after he tells them they can go. But after about the 7th plague, you can see that he kind of loses his ability, even though he wants to. Just like I talked about Sunday, Esau, when he wanted his birthright, sought after it with tears, it says in Scriptures, could not have it. In the same way, that can happen for us as well. All right, that's a different lesson. But Judas is at some point there, and he may be past the point of free will, or he could be in this point where Satan truly is having a strong influence over him. But it continues in verse 3. So Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. This is important because it gives you a description of what's happening in Jesus' mind that enables him to be able to do what he's about to do. To take off his outer clothing and to take on the form or the appearance of a servant and to do the work that a servant does with the towel wrapped around his waist. The way Jesus is able to enter into this type of serving love is by knowing who he truly is, and that it does not depend upon what the people in that room think of him. This is important for us to see. Jesus knew who he was, and he knew what he was there for. He knew what he was there to accomplish. Verse 4, so he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So you may have seen before and heard of this type of service that's being offered here was the lowest form or the highest form of service that would be presented in the house. The lowest servant would be the one who would do it. You know, it's the one who was the lowest on the totem pole in the servants of the house that would do this work because it was considered like climbing on a pile of trash with roadkill on it. That's how dirty they saw this. This is why he removed his outer coat, because it would have, it's like when you're working on a car, you don't wear a suit, right? It would have, all of that would have created dirt on his outer clothing as well. And so he's using this towel and he's absorbing what's on their feet. Now let's think about what's on these guys' feet. They take a journey towards Jerusalem for the Passover meal. And it says here in the book on page 39, Passover had both spiritual and physical themes for Jewish people like Jesus and his disciples. It's about halfway down in that second column. The feast was and remains a pilgrimage festival. This meant that that Jewish believers from all over Judea and further abroad attempted to be in Jerusalem for the week-long celebration. This was partly so the Passover lamb could be slaughtered in the temple precincts by a priest. That was considered kind of like the most acceptable way to celebrate Passover then. So Jesus and his disciples were Galileans from an area about 100 miles north of Jerusalem. And Passover was their reason for being in the city. 100-mile journey, and this isn't a journey on some nice little natural path in the woods. These are on well-trodden roads in rush hour towards Jerusalem. Now, how did they travel in that time? By foot and by what else? Animals. And what do animals do when they're on the road? You know, exhaust. Just like a car, animals have exhaust as well. But it doesn't go away into the air as easily. So these men traveled a long distance in this type of environment. Suffice it to say that their feet were dirty. Okay? And this was not a pleasant thing to take on. You know, Jesus could have stood up and served them food. And he actually does that towards the end of the meal, in a way. He could have, done other things that would have been seen as service and helpful. He could have even given them the right spot. If you remember, they were arguing about who was sitting next to Jesus and things like that. He could have maybe sat instead of at the head or whatever of the table. He could have sat somewhere else. That would have been a less prominent place. Still showing humility. Jesus went to the extreme when it came to showing this. And so washing their feet was something that would have shocked them. And you can see the shock in Simon's response. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." That's kind of a theme when it comes to Jesus and his disciples, especially in the time he was with them on the earth doing ministry. I think most of the time those dudes just walked around confused the whole time. Jesus would say things like, "This is my flesh and this is my blood," when he talks about the bread and whoever eats my flesh can be with me forever. And so some of the things that he would say would have caused them to think, am I making the right choice here? Is this the right life decision to follow this guy? And they wouldn't understand things until things became clear for them later. And so Jesus, even though he's clearly saying this to Peter, I think implied it over and over again as he spent with this time with his disciples. And they're just trying to figure out things that were well beyond the norm for them. And so Jesus says, "Later you'll understand." And then I love Peter's response. No. He's talking to God incarnate in the flesh. And he says, "No, you shall never wash my feet." Now, Peter's intent is probably humility or maybe shame, right? He's like, I don't deserve to have you wash my feet. Kind of like John the baptizer would say, "I'm not even worthy of untying your shoes. You should be baptizing me, not me baptize you." So that's kind of Peter's thought. But the way it comes out in typical Peter fashion is like, are you telling God what to do right now and what he can't do? And then Jesus responds, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." I don't think Jesus is threatening Peter so much, and the lesson talks about this too. It's not like, hey, if you don't do this, you need to leave like Judas. I think it's more so like, if you don't understand what I'm doing, you're not going to get what's coming next, right? Like, if you can't handle me washing your feet, wait till you see me dying for you on a cross. And so Jesus is like, you need to experience this to understand, to have a part with me, is what he's saying. Verse 9, "Then Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." So he wants a whole bath in front of everybody. And Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." Okay, so we'll get to that little dun, dun, dun. The tension in the room now happens. But before that, is Jesus just giving Peter instructions on how to take a bath? Or what's going on here? What do you think he's talking about? I had the same response when I first read it. I had to look at a couple of things to get a sense of what this could be talking about. And some of this is like, trying to guess at a little bit of interpretation here. But Jesus could be referring to, the lesson talks about how he could be referring to sanctification, right? So the idea of you having a bath would be the idea of you entering into a saving relationship with God. And that is being cleansed. That's the justification that comes from becoming a Christian. But then even in the midst of being a justified Christian in God's sight, there are times when you need your feet clean. You need essentially sanctification. You need to continually work on improving your walk with Christ. And maybe Jesus is referring to that. And then he drops this bomb, "Though not every one of you is clean." In other words, not every one of you has justification before the Father. So Jesus is saying, even before Judas is acting in betrayal, even though it's still in his mind, and he'd set everything kind of in motion already, or no, he hadn't yet. He was going to leave to set everything in motion. So it was still in his mind and heart, and he hadn't done anything about it. Jesus was already saying to Judas, "You're not clean." And then verse 11, "For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean." So this is even more evidence for what we just talked about, that Judas was still in the room after the feet were being washed, or during the time that the feet were being washed, and Jesus foreknew what was Judas's plan to the point of when everything was going to be set in motion as well. So what do you think motivated Judas to do this? Money was one of the things that was referred to even in Scripture about this. It talks about how Judas loved money. And he ends up working a deal with the Pharisees for how much money? 30 what? Pieces of silver. And there's some correlation between the price of a slave in the Old Testament and what he got from these Pharisees. And so he worked out this money thing. Any other reasons? We just saw that Satan was prompting Judas as well. There's something else that's not referred here specifically in Scripture, but I think it's important for us to understand about Judas as well. He was a zealot. He was the only of the 12 disciples who was known as a zealot. Well, what's a zealot? Is that just somebody who's zealous about something? Kind of. But he was zealous about the wrong thing. And so the lesson itself talks about this. I think. Maybe. Well, let me just read to you. Verse 40, where in that first column where it says number 2, Luke and John both stated that the prompting of the devil motivated Judas. Matthew indicates that Judas betrayed Jesus because of Judas's love of money that we just saw and talked about. Satan tempts us at our weakest point, and the love of money pits a person against the Lord. And I'm fascinated by this because we're going to go back into a sermon that I preached when I first got here. I think I've mentioned this to you guys before about this battle between Satan and God, especially to try and get to Jesus, that takes place all through the Old Testament, trying to destroy the line of Christ to keep him from coming on the earth. Then when Jesus gets here, Satan tries to destroy Jesus himself, and then after Jesus raises from the dead, he's now at work trying to destroy the church. It's just going to be a 2-part sermon series. We're going to call it the King's Gambit, and it's going to be basically like this chess match thing that's happening between the two of them. But here is a moment of profound conflict spiritually that's taking place, kind of like this crucial moment in battle between Satan and Jesus. And it talks about it in the lesson here, just a paragraph down. It says, John gives us a glimpse into the spiritual battle being waged that evening. Satan seemed to think Jesus' death would be a victory. Satan did not understand how Jesus' sacrificial death would serve the Father's purposes. So Jesus' subsequent resurrection from the dead thwarted all of Satan's plans, and Judas' act of betrayal surely pleased Satan, but God used that evil to further his own plan. That to me is fascinating, how God has this ability to take even what seems to be the worst of all possible scenarios and makes it the best. That just speaks to God's wisdom and his power. Back to the Judas being a zealot thing. I think part of the reason Judas disengaged from Jesus and started doing his own thing to betray Jesus was he was disillusioned by Jesus as a zealot. Zealots were, in fact, I've got a little thing here. This comes from compellingtruth.org, and it describes who the zealots were in the New Testament. So let me just describe that real quick for you. It says, one of Jesus' 12 disciples, known as Simon the Zealot, the Zealots were a political movement among the Jews who sought to overthrow the occupying Roman government. The term zealots comes from the Greek word zelotes. That means, it's like if I were to make up a Greek word for zealots, that's what I would have said. That means, it's like, is that really the Greek word? That means emulator or zealous follower. The first century Jewish historian Josephus mentioned the Zealots as a Jewish political movement started by Judas of Galilee and Zadok the Pharisee in AD 6. Different Judas, but started by these two guys right in the time of Christ. In most respects, they were aligned with the Pharisees of the New Testament period, but further believed that God should be the leader of the nation rather than the Roman government. Since Josephus personally opposed these zealots, his writing emphasized them in a very negative manner. Josephus also noted that Judas of Galilee called the Jews cowards if they continued to pay taxes to Rome. This description of the Zealots made clear they held to the teachings of the Torah, yet believed they were to be enforced through activism and even acts of violence. This belief would later play an important role in the history of Israel that would influence the writers of the New Testament. When imperial cult worship was introduced in Israel, that was the Roman government's form of worship, the Zealots helped lead a military revolt against the Romans in AD 66, so 36 or 33 years or so after Jesus' death. They were initially successful in this revolt, yet the Romans later destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. So the Zealots' revolt is partly to blame for the destruction of the temple in AD 70, which set into motion a whole lot of things for the New Testament church. All this goes back to what we, I think, sometimes fall into a trap of, even today, where we start to believe that our government or politics can change this world better than Jesus can. It simply cannot. It's okay to be politically active. It's okay to be wanting the right things to happen in our country and to think of our country as one that's blessed by God. That is very true. But it is also saved by God, not just by politics. And so what we had in Judas, in this crowd of disciples, amongst these 12, he was the one who was the most politically aware and active, and he knew what the solution was for the Jewish people in Rome. It was a military battle started by Jesus. And once he used his power to get everybody together to fight Rome, then finally the great days of David, King David, would come back on the earth, and we would have years of prosperity as God's followers. So Judas wanted what he thought was the right thing. It was just that he didn't conceive how big God's plan was for the kingdom, that it wasn't just about an earthly kingdom. It was about something that transcended all of that. So when Jesus shows up in Jerusalem on the back of a donkey instead of the back of a white horse, and when he gets into Jerusalem, after he's throwing people out of the temple, which you should be attacking the Romans, not the Jewish people. What's going on, Jesus? And then he starts basically talking about being handed over and to be crucified. Judas is hearing all of this, and he's like, what are you doing? Like, this is not the kingdom. What's going on, right? So my imagination is saying here at this point that as a zealot, Judas was disillusioned. And that's really what caused him to be in a position that Satan could use to betray Jesus. So Judas didn't just wake up one morning and think to himself, you know what, I'm just going to betray the Son of God, the man that I've been living with for the past 3 years and following. This built up in him, and it came from a place where it always comes from when people are being deceived, from a sense that they're doing the right thing, but they are not understanding where God is moving as opposed to where they think God should be going. So just an important insight that I think we should be aware of. Now, that has not a whole lot to do with what Jesus is trying to demonstrate. So let's get back to serving love. As it continues there in the John 13:12 section there, it says, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. So going back to, Jesus knew this about himself, and he never wavered on saying that's who he was. But then he says, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. What did I write down here? So then down in verse 15, as it explains here, it says, history tells us, this is the bottom of that first column, history tells us foot washing was not practiced in the first century church as witnessed by the book of Acts and other early Christian sources. The reason is that Jesus lifted up his action as an example of humble service. He was not introducing a new custom among the people of Israel. Rather, the command is for all disciples of Jesus to be servants of one another. This is the very essence of following Jesus. So what this is talking about is, you may have heard people say before, and there's churches that still practice foot washing services. And they will say, well, in the same place that Jesus said, do this remembering me, speaking of communion, right, the bread and the juice, he also washed people's feet. So why, if you're doing communion, are you not washing people's feet? And so the argument against the current practice, though there's nothing wrong with washing people's feet because it's still a humbling experience. And it's really neat to see this done in weddings. That's something that's oftentimes you'll see happening. Churches still do this, even though they know it's not necessarily commanded by Jesus to do it specifically in that way, literally. So it can be a good practice, but it's not the level of communion in terms of the way Jesus asked us to do it. He was setting an example for us to follow. And from everything we can tell from church history in the first century church, that wasn't a common practice for the first century church. What was a common practice for them every week was meeting together for the Lord's Supper. So that's why we see the difference between the two there. And then it finishes off here as it goes down into verse 32. And he says, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." Okay, so it's almost like Jesus is giving us the answer to the question that Judas had that he thought he had the right answer to. Judas thought the way that we're going to get people to respect God and to honor him is to use power and authority with the government. And Jesus is saying instead, the way you get people to know about the Father and to worship him is to do it through love and service, which is a different approach, right? From top down, now we're going bottom up and serving people and surprising them with love. And that's how they're going to know about who Jesus is. So let's think through this with the little bit of time that we have left here. I got my little marker board here. And what I want to do is just first start by thinking through, it says, this commandment from Jesus on verse 34, love one another as I have loved you. So, how has Jesus loved us? We'll start with that. How has Jesus, and think through like just not just the obvious, I'm going to take the obvious answer. Died on the cross for us, okay? Right? All right, everybody was thinking that, okay? But there's even more than that Jesus demonstrated while he was in ministry. And so Jesus wants them to think through the example he just gave and then all the different ways Jesus loved the disciples that are recorded in the Gospels. Let's think through those examples that Jesus gave to think of how Jesus demonstrated love in his ministry. So we know he died on the cross for us. What else has Jesus done?
Forgiven them.
Forgiveness. Okay. What's an example of that? When did Jesus forgive someone right there in the moment? Okay, woman at the well. Okay, so even though she's not necessarily directly offending Jesus in that moment, her sin against the Father was offensive to him because he's the Son of the Father. So he forgives her sin. And I'm thinking specifically like even stuff that people did against him directly, he forgave, right? You mentioned the cross where he asked the Father to forgive those who were hurting him.
The thief on the cross.
Thief on the cross, right? He was, I don't know if he joined in the insulting, but didn't the gospel say that both of them were insulting Jesus and then kind of like one of them had a change of heart and said, what are we doing? And so he forgave him that way. He said, today you'll be with me in paradise. So Jesus forgave, and I'm thinking of Peter, right? So Peter betrayed Jesus, and when Jesus came back to reinstate Peter, he slowly went through the process of forgiveness to rebuild Peter. Okay, what else?
He's patient.
Patient. What's an example of how he was patient?
I'm just thinking like with the disciples when they just didn't get what he was saying, he could have just said, "Oh, forget these people. I'm going to go get some other people." But he stuck with them. He gave them what they needed.
Yeah. Once again, I keep picking on Peter, but another one of those where Peter says to Jesus something, and Jesus responds with, "Get behind me, Satan." Remember that? I think Jesus was talking about going to basically suffering in the cross, and Peter was saying, "Never, this will never happen to you." And then Jesus says, "You don't have the things of God in mind, but you have the things of Satan in mind." It took some patience. I imagine in the time when he asked them to stay awake while he was praying in the garden, and he keeps going back, and they're all sleeping at the same time. He understands their weakness, and there was patience with that. Okay. So, it's another one, the garden. Forgiven woman at the well. Any other things that you see Jesus demonstrated love with?
I think he demonstrated it beginning in Genesis, because a plan was set in motion in Genesis 3 that Satan would be trod down.
Yeah, I would say a good word for that would be resolve. Like he was resolute. And I would say, even from the very beginning, you're referring to Genesis 3:15, where the Father says that the woman's seed would crush the serpent's head, and the serpent would strike his heel. That was the declaration of war from the Father down to Satan, and it was a resolute thing. And all the way to the point that you see Jesus' resolve. He was not deterred, distracted the whole time he was on the earth, even in the time of temptation in the wilderness, right, that Jesus had. So, forgive me if this isn't really expressing that, but I think resolve is definitely something. It's like the kind of love that a mom has for her kid when someone does something and she goes into mama bear mode, and she will not be deterred from righting the wrong that happened. There's no turning left or right on that situation. I remember one time I told my mom about these kids who were picking on me in the bus stop, and maybe you moms in here have had situations like that. And you just shift into this other person all of a sudden. And I saw that happen with my mom. I could see it in her eye right then. She's like, "Where's this kid?" I remember this because I'm like horrified, because I'm thinking, what's my mom? I've never seen my mom in attack mode like this before. What's she going to do to this little kid? And then what's going to happen after she's not there and I got to go back to that same bus stop? Sure enough, we walked. I told her that last I saw her, he was at the playground because I didn't want to get in trouble. And we walked over, and I was probably like 7 years old or something like that. And she saw that kid, and she gave him a tongue lashing. I was like, yeah. That kid was like different after that. So resolve. So you can see that in the way that he continued through temptation and all that. Anything else?
Gentleness.
Gentleness, all right. So what's an example of that?
The children, always allowing the children to go through.
Yeah, so I think even a bigger picture, he walked slowly through the crowd, right? You know what I mean? So when a kid came, and you remember when the little ones came to Jesus and the disciples were like, all right, we got a rabbi here. You guys need to chill out. Be quiet in church. And Jesus is like, let the little ones come to me, for their angels, I think he says, speak directly to the Father in heaven, which is kind of cool when you think about, like, I think my little grandbaby has an angel speaking directly to the Father in heaven, a little guardian angel. And then, the people who needed miracles, Jesus, like I said, had a very precise sense of timing. He knew when he had to be at certain places and where. So I think in that way, Jesus had that type A personality, but it came through as type B when he was going through the crowd, and someone just blast him with, hey, I need this. My daughter is sick and she's going to die unless you come. And how many times did that happen in Jesus' ministry, right? So open to distraction, maybe. Okay. Anything else you guys think of? These are all good. So the second question I would ask, and I'm not going to write all those down, but what does that look like for us today? Because what Jesus is saying here is, love one another as I have loved you. Okay, so that means all of these different ways that we can think of. How do you go to a cross for someone else? What does that mean? Like, how can we love one another in the way that Jesus loved us to the point of the cross? What does that mean for us?
Sacrificing something that, sacrificing
Okay?
Something that costs us.
Yeah, so we're talking about a level of sacrifice that I don't think we're going to be able to measure up, right? I mean, there's hopefully not a time where we're going to have to die for someone else on a cross anytime soon, right? So let's try and think of what is possible for us to get to that, even too close to that level, and it's hard to imagine, isn't it? And so when you think of Jesus went to the cross, therefore I need to slow down and help somebody, it's like, right? Good perspective, though, isn't it?
But he said, no greater love than to lay down your life for your friend.
Yeah. Yep. And so then even Jesus doing this for his enemies is how that scripture says we should love. So obviously we forgive. And how did Jesus forgive people? Did he forgive without expectation? I think he forgave freely, but he still gave expectation, right? You think about the woman caught in sin, and he saves her life at risk of his own reputation, and then tells her to sin no more. Right? So still, there's expectation there. Same thing with Peter. When he forgives Peter for the betrayal, he tells him what to do. Yeah, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Keeps repeating that. This is going to cost Peter's life. And Jesus knows this. In fact, he told Peter, you will be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with. Which means you're going to die for your belief. So he knows it's going to happen. And he refers to it a little bit here when he's like, you don't understand now, but you will understand what it means to be a servant. So we forgive, but we forgive not just so that we feel better. We forgive for the person's good. And I think there's a difference there. Patience, resolve. And thinking about temptation, too, in our life when it comes to stuff that we are sensitive to, right? Satan always aims strategically at us, so he knows where our weak spot is, and he's going to go for that chink in our armor every time. And when we are resisting that temptation, one thing that can help us with that is understanding not just how it affects us when we give into it, but also what effect it would have on other people when we give into it. That's a huge thing for me. Imagine if I drop back into the same things that I fell into previously that I've shared with you guys before, and in the context that I'm in now, right? Well, if the preacher of this church does this, then what good is knowing Jesus, right? So part of the motivation for me to resist temptation has to do not just with my reputation, but God's reputation with people. So resolve is a big part of that, how we love as well. It's a way for us to care for people and their faith by how we practice our own. Okay, so that's the idea. I hope you see that. And this is a good practice for you. If you're reading through the Gospels and you think about, okay, where is Jesus loving here? Where is he loving? How is he expressing love? And then what does that look like for me on my day-to-day schedule? We're not going to carry a cross through Walmart, but we're going to hopefully be patient. And we're going to be, aware and sensitive and walk slowly through these masses of people that we sometimes see in these places and think about, well, here's someone who looks like they're hurting. And maybe you're not the type of personality to say, hey, is there something I can pray for you about? Because it looks like you're stressed. But you can still pray for them without them even knowing it, right? So these are just ways for us to practice our faith, very practical ways, and love as Jesus has loved us. So show your love. That's the thought to remember from the lesson. And I hope you can remember that. We have 3 minutes. So let me read this to you. I think this is kind of a cool connection. This is out of the devotions, and it's on October 28th in the little devotion book. It makes a connection between feet and service in a way that it's pretty creative. So October 28th, it's called Boots of Grace, and it comes out of the text Ephesians 4:7. To each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. And so it says, when I was a tyke of no more than 2 or 3, I tried wearing my dad's cowboy boots. I did exactly as I watched him do. I placed one foot in one boot and then put on the other boot. Only the boots swallowed my entire legs. I stood proud and tall as if I filled my dad's shoes, but I could only stand there. I had no ability to move because his boots were just too big. But now, since I have long legs, just like my dad, his boots would fit and I could walk in them. The grace Christ apportions to each of us fits us precisely. He gives us the exact gift that he chooses for us to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up. These gifts do not come as a result of anything we have done, but we are to use them for the kingdom. They are gifts of grace for serving and encouraging one another, to build unity and maturity among our brothers and sisters in Christ. As we use our gifts and grow into them, we should recognize how we're becoming more and more like Christ, walking in his steps. So put your Jesus boots on. They may not fit too well in the beginning. They may feel awkward in the beginning to practice some of these things, but you'll grow into it. And before long, you will see how easily you can transform people's lives as they meet Christ through your actions and words. So something to encourage you about today. We will talk about some prayer stuff. So we'll cut the feed and just see what's happening with you all.